After Milarepa, it became known by the Tibetans kind of that they could attain Buddhahood in their lifetime, that a Tibetan could attain Buddhahood. That was sort of his real symbolic significance that he came to hold for the Tibetan people. And after that, more people began to turn toward gradually and progressively more and more people turned toward the monastic curriculum, and then many went into these long retreats following Milarepa. And basically, they kind of created a wave, a kind of charisma of the possibility of using a human life for the self-transformative kind of yoga of a human life. And the society began more and more orienting itself towards that. And a little bit after Milarepa's time, in the 13th century, a geopolitical event occurred that supported Tibetans in doing that, which was fortuitous, really, with the way that they were going. And that was, namely, I mean, for the Tibetans it was fortuitous. It wasn't very fortuitous for a lot of other people, but it was for the Tibetans. Namely, the Genghis Khan arose in the world. And Genghis Khan, in spite of his rather predatory nature, he had a profound impact on the world. Many people credit Genghis Khan with enabling the Renaissance, actually. In fact, there is a historical theory like that. But whatever the byproduct of Genghis Khan's conquests, Tibet surrendered to Genghis Khan before he arrived in Tibet, because they saw what he did to countries that resisted him in the early period of his conquest, which was namely eradicate them. And they didn't feel like doing that, and so they surrendered. And then Kublai Khan, his grandson, appointed a lama, the Sakya Pandita his name was, the head lama of the Sakyapa order, to regency over Tibet. Not only sort of spiritual authority over his empire, Pakpa, and then especially, Sakya Pandita, and especially Sakya Pandita's nephew, Pakpa, became Kublai Khan's preceptor and sort of spiritual instructor. And so actually was like the spiritual teacher of the Mongol Empire, in fact, when Marco Polo went there. Therefore, Marco Polo didn't like him much because Marco Polo was sort of connected with Western religious forces. And the Mongol Empire was religiously pluralistic, but in the court there was competition between Taoists and Buddhists and Christians and all different kinds of people, Muslims, for sort of control of the emperor and the royal family. And the Pakpa, the Tibetan Buddhist guy, won that competition. But the effect of this in Tibet was that it sort of gave Tibetans the pattern and the idea that a monastic political administration, a social administration, was a useful thing. Tibetans kind of got an idea like that, which is an unusual idea. I mean, monasteries in every other Asian country had nothing to do with the social administration of the state. They did, of course, have their own estates in most Buddhist countries, because the way you gave endowment to institutions in Asian countries, agricultural countries, is you give them land, and then they get the tithe from that land. And in Sri Lanka or India or Thailand or wherever it was, that was the way that monasteries were supported. Like today, if you wanted to endow a monastery, you would give stock. But in those days, you would give, land was stock because it yielded so and so many bushels of this or that, which could be then sold for whatever, And so that's how monasteries were endowed. And so monasteries were practical organizations always. They had custodians, they had treasurers, they had cooks, they had people who were in charge of different offices, books, librarians, things like that. Any institution will have a kind of bureaucracy. But they had never used that bureaucracy to administer a country ever in any other case in Buddhist history. Occasionally learned monks, there's a few cases of former monks becoming emperors and then rulers of countries, but giving up being monks. In China this happened occasionally, and it happened in Thailand occasionally. But there was never a case where someone remaining a monk then took administrative responsibility in a country. And at first it seems like, I used to think when I did my Tibetan studies, I used to think that it was a deviance and that there was a problem with it. And I had the attitude that it was a corruption of Buddhism, actually. And something had gone wrong in Tibetan history. Just that was my naive view when I was studying and enjoying very much the teachings. But I thought historically and socially, something must have gone wrong in Tibet. Like, what are these lamas doing running the country? Sort of a Western, I think, anti-theocratic attitude I had made me think it was very suspect. And I even once said to the Dalai Lama when I was young, he's so patient with me always, I said, Your Holiness, why don't you give up running Tibet and being the leader of Tibet? Why don't you just renounce Tibet? China has taken over, and that's very bad for your people. and you are imprisoned here. In those days, he wasn't allowed out of India, and the Indian government would not allow him to make political statements in India for fear of the Chinese. This was the early 60s. And so he really was completely paralyzed, couldn't move which way, you know, although he led his community in exile. And so I said, look, if you renounce Tibet, then you can go all over the world as a spiritual teacher, and the Tibetan people will become known, and you'll just be a guru, you know. And you'll get into the guru game, you know, and forget about it, and just say, look, somehow Tibet got into a funny attitude where we had lamas running the country, but every other Buddhist country has an ordinary secular king, and that's what we should do in Tibet in the future. And so, you know, the Chinese invading is bad, and there's something should be done about it, but I'm not going to be responsible politically. The government exile can be run by ministers, and, you know, I'm just going to be a Buddhist teacher and go around like that. And his secretaries were having conniptions as they overheard this, and they were really, the rudeness and the dreadfulness of it. And then he used to agree with me. He'd say, that's exactly what I want to do. That's what I would prefer to do. You are absolutely correct. Shakyamuni Buddha did refuse to run the kingdom, and I would rather be detached from having the worldly responsibility of that, and rather just do my Dharma practice and do my Dharma teaching. But I couldn't do that, because so many Tibetans depend on me. And if I don't look out for them, who will really effectively do it? And I don't know if I'm going to be able to myself, but I'm their best chance, and therefore I can't give it up. And they would become desperate and despair. They believe in me. Too much, he said, they believe in me, but they do believe in me. So he used to tell me that very patiently. You know. But then years later, when I actually studied it, I then studied this process, which I'm now describing to you, how this happened. And I began to feel that it was not a corruption, but it was actually the logical conclusion, in a way, of the Buddhist movement. You know, those of you who know my Inner Revolution book will see how I present that as a logical conclusion. And that I'm going to summarize it a little bit today, actually, although I don't have that book here with me, but I'll summarize it. Anyway, it sort of happened by accident, in a way, with this Sakyapa thing. Now, that had been prepared for, though, by the fact that, as I think I mentioned to you before I got into Milarepa, how the regional noble families in Tibet, in this second period, began to align themselves with particular Buddhist orders. And they backed a certain monastery in their region. And for example, in the case of the Sakyapas, they created a very interesting interconnection between the Kun family, a family called Kun, and the Sakya monastery, which was founded by sort of very learned, holy translators and sages and saints and things, whereby the leadership of the monastery was always one of the generations, one of the heads of the family of the Sakyapa order. So that, you know, one guy who would be the head of the family would be the head abbot of the monastery. Then, since he was an abbot and a monk, he couldn't have children. So his brother's child would then become the next abbot. And then that child's brother's child would become the next abbot. So they would go uncle, nephew, uncle, nephew. That's how they would go. And they believed that the family was kind of magical because it was a family that had been ennobled back in the time of the royal dynasty. And they had been, some of the scions of that family, one of the scions of that family had been one of the first 7 monks that were ordained by Shantarakshita in the early period, at the first monastery. Remember the story of the first monastery I told you about? And also, another of the family members had been one of the famous 25 disciples of Padmasambhava, who became a great adept and a yogi type of thing. And so they didn't just hark back to the time of the ancient warlords, sort of aristocratic blood from ancient conquests. They were also the new type of Buddhist aristocracy, where they were ancient saints in the lineage, if you see what I'm saying, the Kun family. Then they have a myth. If you read the Sakyapa history of the Sakyapa order, they have a myth about how they descended from the sun, and, you know, like a real thing like that, just within the Sakyapa small clan itself. So they had this relationship, therefore, where the noble family, although they had an army, they had their peasants, they had their serfs, they had their regular way of running a country in an aristocratic way, but they sort of tempered that by making the purpose of their running their country the supporting of this Sakyapa monastery. And the head of the family was always the abbot of the monastery. And this developed similar sort of symbiotic relationships between the head aristocratic family of a region and the most important monastery of that region, developed here and there in Tibet, often with this kind of uncle-nephew sort of relationship, like with the Sakyapas. But at that time, in the 13th century this is, there was no reincarnation as such until, official one. Now, in the Karmapa group, Then there was the Kagyupas, following from Milarepa. Milarepa's main disciple for the purposes of the Kagyupa order was Gampopa, someone called Gampopa, who was a doctor and a scholar and a monk. And so he founded, Marpa, remember, was a layman translator. Milarepa was a layman yogi. And then he had another layman yogi disciple called Rechungpa, who was very important. But the only disciple he had who was a monk, who was really important, was this Gampopa guy. And Gampopa then founded the Kagyupa order, really, because to have an order, you had to have a monastic body, you had to have a monastic university and a monastic curriculum. And then a disciple of the Gampopa, a famous disciple of his was someone called Pagmo Truba, and then his disciple was the first Karmapa, somebody who was eventually recognized as the first Karmapa. His name was Dusum Khyentse. He died, right, and I think in the late 13th century, he died. I'm trying to remember. No, early 13th century. And then there was a break of some years, like 10 years or quite a few years, not just the 6 months or 49 days or a year or something that they sometimes do, the reincarnations. Quite a longer period. And then a guy was born somewhere who said, I'm not so-and-so, I'm the Karmapa, I want to go back to find my disciples. That was the beginning of the reincarnation institution in Tibet. Then people said first, oh, he's crazy. What's the matter with this kid, and what, and they didn't believe him. But then he went back and he recognized all his old people, and they played different tricks on him, and he recognized that, the way that they then later formalized in the test for a reincarnate Lama. And so the Karmapa was the first reincarnation in Tibetan history. But that reincarnation became the principle of leadership in that order, in the sense that they would always look for the new head. And the Karmapa Kagyu order was one of 12 suborders within the Kagyupa. The Karmapa was not the head of the Kagyupas, only of his order of the Kagyupas. Okay? So this kind of different sort of experiments in administration and monastic rule, in the relationship between the monastic and the charismatic sort of hermit yogin like Milarepa, developed through the 13th century into the early 14th century. And from around 1244, I believe is the date is usually given, or 1247, I think, to 1368, was the time of the Yuan dynasty in China, which is the Chinese name for the Mongol Empire, when the Mongol Empire had China under its control. And during that time, Tibet was formally run by a regent, that is to say a political authority, which was the head of the Sakyapa order, particularly Pakpa, and then Pakpa's own nephew took over after him, and it went on until 1368. So that was when the Tibetans first had a taste of sort of monastic administration, and it was a relatively peaceful period for Tibet because they were federated with, they weren't occupied by any Mongols. That was their main objective, was to keep the Mongols from coming in, because apparently when Mongols showed up, they kind of took what they wanted, they billeted themselves here and there, they were a little unruly, they were a little bit rowdy types. And so, but anyway, they were under this hugely powerful empire that conquered all of, most of Eurasia. And their head regent was also the spiritual preceptor of the emperor. So there was a lot of gifts given to them. They thrived. They did very well, really. And so they got into this idea that it was that the people then didn't have local warlords battling with each other, and the preoccupation of the people was more and more intensified into Buddhism. And then they got the idea that it was kind of nice to be run or to be governed by a lama, because lamas were more into having you study and this and that. Not that their administrations were perfect or that every monk in the administration, there were no corrupt monk officials. There certainly were. But the point is, it was a little better than military administration, basically. Although there still was some military around, and it was far from perfect, but it just kind of gave Tibetans a taste of this. Now, and then what happened under that too, another important element that happened was that with the expansion of the monastic institution and the expansion of the monastic curriculum, there was a lot of, the Sakyapandita himself was a tremendous scholar. He was, in fact, when he was a little boy, the Sakyapandita, Kunga Genzen was his name, he babbled incoherently, and everybody thought he was an idiot, and they were very embarrassed, the parents, and they were thinking, how can we now have a different abbot, for we have given birth to an idiot? And at one point, some Indian wandering scholar came by, Indian pundit said, and listened to the boy babbling and said, he's no idiot, he's babbling in Sanskrit. Because he was such an amazing incarnation himself of some wisdom being, that he knew already Sanskrit from youth, like Mozart. And he started writing books when he was very young, and he was a fantastic teacher and writer. And Sakyapanita really provided the sort of textual basis of the Sakyapa order. Although many other books were written by his predecessors and his successors, he really sort of gave the encyclopedic synthesis that really firmed up, you could say, the curriculum of the Sakyapa monastic order. Longchen Rabjamba was also educated in the Karamba order originally, but he came from a Nyingmapa family, and then after leaving that monastery, he became a yogi living in the mountains. And then he wrote voluminously, however, and he put the Nyingmapa order on a solid textual basis. He sort of synthesized all of the Dharma, because the Dharma is terribly complicated, Buddhism, because Buddha, unlike Jesus, he didn't teach for a short time and give sort of a simple message of faith. He taught for 45 years, and he taught different things to different people according to their aptitudes. And some people he taught about selflessness, some people he taught about self, some people he taught about emptiness, some people he taught about fullness. He taught some Tantra, he taught some Mahayana, some Hinayana, some to be monks, some not to be monks. So it was very confusing. So when they would, in a new country where the Buddhist institution would come, people would spend a number of generations sorting it out and trying to figure out how the different things related to each other, how to interpret it, this sort of thing. And Sakyapanita did that. Then this Longchen Rabjamba, who lived, I think, 1300 to 1364, or 1307 to 1364, he was the great writer of the Nyingmas who lived at that time. And the Kagyupas didn't have, their great writer was Gampopa, original founder, a little earlier in the 12th century. And then they had, the Karmapas were important writers during these later centuries. And then in 1357, then there was a guy called Dolbupa, who was an important writer, Bodongba. There were many, many people who wrote collected works of like 250 volumes. I mean volumes that are 700 pages. Reference editor here is freaking out here. 700 pages a piece, in Tibetan, which translated into about 1,400 pages in English. 250 volumes like that. I mean, they were monks. They from a young age, and they would just, these genius types would learn already in the age 7 or 10, they'd start writing, and they would and there was all this huge Buddhist literature, and they would memorize an enormous amount until they were around 15, and then they would begin to debate it, to analyze it, meditate a little bit. Then in their 20s, they'd start writing, and they'd just write for 40, 50, 60 years. The life average in Tibet was not that high in those days, but when you lived longer, then you lived a long time, though. Those who made it past certain parameters. And there's so many people such a high percentage of the population were monastic and were educated that there was a voluminous literature was produced in this time. Now, during the whole time, this is what I call the feudal and medieval period that is still going on here, though, because still, although the monastic institution is growing and growing, and there was the moment when the Sakyapas ruled as regents of the Mongolians who were outside, there was a kind of more pacific structure within Tibet with less conflict amongst local warlords because nobody dared mess with the Mongols who could come in at any time. And so they sort of followed the head lama's order, and it was fairly peaceful in the country. However, in 1368, when the Mongol Empire fragmented somewhat, they withdrew from China, and the Ming Dynasty began in China. And there were different factions amongst the Mongols then after that. The Sakyapas lost their hegemony because there was no one backing them up. And then the Pagmodrubas, well, 3 different dynasties arose over 3 centuries, which were run by lay rulers, aristocratic warlord types, who affiliated, though, they were still in this style of affiliating with an important lama or an important monastery, important order, but they didn't really, they ran things, and they had their armies, and they had fights with other noble families from different regions. The more struggle there were, actually, and the more violence and the more dislocation of people and problems caused by sort of mundane ambitions, the more people were interested in the life of enlightenment and becoming educated or going on retreat, being a Milarepa, being a Sakyapanita, whatever. And more people would join these orders. And this process came to a kind of culmination, I believe, in the end of the 14th century, and the sort of focus figure was a guy named Tsongkhapa, Losang Takpa was his name, Tsongkhapa, who, born in 1357, who was considered reincarnation of Manjushri. He also began to teach at the age of 3 and all this. I mean, he was a prodigy, and there were signs, and a master came from central Tibet all the way to northeast Tibet, like 2,000 miles, having heard from the fairies that this amazing person was born. They have all this sort of legendary stuff. about him, and he was considered the incarnation of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And he went down to central Tibet when he was around 18. He studied with 55 different teachers. At the age of 20, he wrote his first major book and was much sought after as a teacher. But by 25, he was sick of being an academic teacher, so to speak, and he met an illiterate cowherd, sort of like Rumi's. I don't know if you know the biography of Rumi, some of you, but he met this guy called Shamsi Tabriz, who was a sort of mystic but uneducated, and all his scholarly friends were very jealous of this Shams. So the same, Tsongkhapa had this guy called Lama Umapa, who was an illiterate cowherd, yak herder from eastern Tibet, who one day heard a noise sort of like a freight train was going to run over him and passed out. And when he woke up, he was seeing Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. He has this sword and a book in one hand. He holds a book like this and a sword of wisdom in the other hand. And after that Lama Umapa always saw the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And he got educated, tutored by an angel, basically, like as if being tutored by an angel. Tibetan mystical stories are really fun in that sense, in that people don't just have some sort of blinding vision of Jesus or an angel or something that leaves them trembling for days in the wake. They sit down and have tea with these guys, and they chat with them, and they ask them questions, and the guys like correct their punctuation and spelling, and they talk for days or weeks and months, or recurrently talk with these spiritual presences. So Tsongkhapa heard that Lama Umapa came into sort of Tsongkhapa's like traveling around from monastery to monastery, came into his orbit, and he heard that he was doing that, and he then said, well, I want to study with Manjushri myself. Will you translate my questions to Manjushri? Because I've asked my questions to 55 teachers here in Tibet, and they're great answers and this and that, but there's still some fine points that I'm not satisfied with the answers with. So will you please ask Manjushri directly? I mean, that's like asking the God of wisdom, the questions about wisdom, about the nature of reality, about the deepest view, about the central way, about how to understand selflessness to the full depth with instincts included. So he did that. He went off and he went on retreat with this Lama Umapa and asked all these questions of Manjushri. And then after about halfway through that, Lama Umapa said, well, don't you want to talk directly yourself? You don't have to constantly ask me. And he said, yes, I do. So then Lama Umapa taught him certain things at Manjushri's instructions. And he prayed and meditated and purified himself. And eventually he could see Manjushri too. And the rest of his life, he would ask questions directly of Manjushri in the Tibetan legend. There's a wonderful painting of him in his biography where you see him sitting when he's older now. And Manjushri is sitting in the sky there, holding up this sword. And then there's a sword, a hilt of it is in the heart of Manjushri, and the point of it is in the heart of Tsongkhapa. And then there's this like golden elixir flowing down, gold and silver elixir flowing down the sword. And then there's these like 8 disciples sitting next to Tsongkhapa, which are Tsongkhapa's students. And then little sprays are coming off the sword, and they have their mouths like that. And this nectar is going into their mouths. It's a beautiful painting, actually. It really is a lovely one. So then Tsongkhapa, at a certain point around 1393, he reached a point with Manjushri where Manjushri started getting annoyed with him and said, look, you have been asking me these questions over and over. I gave you the answers already. Any answer more than you need. You are still a nihilist, I'm sorry to say. And you think you mix up nothingness with emptiness still. And you think if you have a blank mind on a good day, you've really gone deep. And that's a complete mistake. And you're just a nihilist. And you confuse having nothing in your mind with realizing voidness, emptiness, which is very, very different. But on the other hand, if you work at it and you're careful not to exaggerate and confuse nothingness with voidness, you will have a correct and deep insight eventually. But you have to go on a long retreat and purify yourself, all your karmic obstructions, your false instinctual habits. You have to really make it deeper, and you have to do a long retreat and stop asking me questions. And then people got very alarmed, and Tsongkhapa said, well, I have invitations from like 100 different monasteries to go and teach in this and that season, this and that text. Many, many monks who need to learn that, and they want me to do it. I would be letting down my responsibility if I did that. And he said, you don't know what is responsibility. If you go and teach there, it will have a superficial benefit. If you go on this retreat, however, then later if you teach, it might have some real benefit if you work hard and gain some insight in this retreat. So then he went into retreat from 1393 to 1398 with 8 disciples in a place that I visited. I like to go to in Tibet, my favorite place, called Ulka Valley, which is on the side of on the northwest side of the most sort of sacred ancient mountain of Tibetan tribe, kind of. It was Mount Ude Gungyal, amazing, huge mountain. That is remarkable, you know, over 20,000 foot peak in central Tibet. And very windy and scary place. You know, there's a Tibetan tribal deity lives there. You know, it's like Sinai of Tibet. And on the side of that, and then I thought when I went there that I was going to find Tsongkhapa's retreat place, and I found out that the retreat monastery called Öde, which is called Olka Cholung, is down on the side, but actually where he did his retreat is at about 13,000 feet, that retreat place. But where he did his retreat is 17,000 feet in a cave called the Yama's Tongue Cave. And Yama is the god of death, and under the tongue of the god of death, and there's a spring that comes out of the back of that cave, but it's above this tree line, and it's really cold and difficult. I tried 3 times to get up there, and still I haven't made it because of weather, you know, and I was in a dirt schedule with a group, and I had other people. I couldn't make it. I tried each time and had to turn back. One of my graduate students did make it, though, so I know it's there, and I know it has a beautiful water. I have a little vial of water from this cave. So anyway, he went there for 5 years, and he did 3,500,000 prostrations, full prostrations. You know what that is, a full prostration? You know, you go like this, and then you go all the way flat out on the floor, extend all the way, and then you get up. So it's like a push-up and a sit down and whatever. And your knees get raw, your elbows, your head, your forehead gets all calloused from bumping itself on the floor. And it's a tremendous calisthenic, you know. 3,500,000. He offered a million mandalas. It's a sort of offering of the universe to the enlightened beings. He recited a million 100-syllable mantras of Vajrasattva. He did all these sort of purificatory practices, and then did a lot of deep meditation, and then kept up all his studying, actually, as well, and had many, many different visions. There's an amazing visionary biography that recounts all the many visions that he had. But he still was not satisfied with things. And then in 1398, one morning, he had a dream in which he was in the Tushita paradise, which is where the Bodhisattva Maitreya lives. And it's typical in these Tibetan mystical things, as I'm saying. Tushita paradise, it's one of the heavens of the desire realm, one of the 6 heavens of the desire realm in the Indian cosmology. It is not on the axial mountain, it's sort of up in the sky, but it still has kind of real estate in it. And there's many gods live there, but then there's also like a Dharma center there, where the Buddhas dwell before they come to the earth, on their way down from a higher heaven. And currently Maitreya Buddha, it's the home of Maitreya Buddha where he teaches, the future Buddha, you know, the next Buddha. So he dreamed he was there in the presence of Maitreya. And apparently that Tushita, that Dharma center of Maitreya's in Tushita, is a favorite place for retired professors of Buddhism from different Buddhist monastic universities, pandits, you know, Indian and Tibetan pandits. And Nagarjuna was there, the great middle way teacher, Buddhapalita, his great commentator, Chandrakirti, Aryadeva, the great philosophers of voidness, you know, were all there having a big debate and discussion about voidness. So in his dream, you know, and he was on the outside skirts of this group having this wonderful discussion with the Buddha Maitreya sitting there above them, and just loving it. And then Buddhapalita got up, the commentator, and brought a book, like this very tall, dark-skinned guy from South India, Buddhapalita, and he touched Tsongkhapa on the head, and Tsongkhapa woke up with a feeling of blessing. You know, he touched the book on his head, which is a Tibetan gesture of blessing. And so then when he woke up, he was feeling really great, but sort of still like, you know, thinking this, that, and worrying. Then he went back to where he had been reading in the 18th chapter of Nagarjuna's 27-chapter critique of false views, called a book called Wisdom, the Fundamental Critiques of the Middle Way, it's called, or of the Central Way. And he was just looking, he actually had his finger on the page, and he was reading in a verse that says, the self is not the body-mind aggregates, or the body-mind processes, nor is the self different from the body-mind processes. He was just reading that sentence. And when he did, suddenly he attained enlightenment, as they put it, meaning that everything in the universe changed into the opposite of what he expected it to be whenever he might have become enlightened. He immediately wrote a poem of praise of Shakyamuni Buddha he kind of had a vision of the Buddha in this enlightenment experience, and he wrote a poem to him praising him for his teaching of relativity, for the teaching of relativity. Namely that, you know, that since all things are empty with respect to any intrinsic identity or intrinsic reality, therefore they are totally interrelated and everything is totally relative. So this teaching of relativity, he felt at this moment of seeing, really finally settling in his mind all of the problems he was concerned about and having this ecstatic experience of total freedom and total insight, he attributed this great thing as to the teaching of relativity, of relationality, which is why I think it probably was opposite from what he expected, what you viscerally expect, because naturally, you see, we are all very self-centered, right? We think that, there's something about it. We feel habitually like we are something special and separate from the world. We all feel that way naturally, right? So then you naturally think that when the most special possible thing happens to you in a culture where you believe that it's possible, namely where you become Buddha, a perfect Buddha, that you're going to be feeling especially special, right? And way beyond the world, you see. You'll be liberated, free. We have language of nirvana, and free of suffering, and blissful and happy, and completely like infinite, and all this kind of thing, you see, and sort of apart from things, you see. I mean, you expect, because you feel apart from things normally, do you see what I mean? So then, even though you may have a definition of selflessness, yeah, great selflessness, but when I realize that I'm going to be Buddha, means I'm going to sort of be above and beyond everything. It's kind of what you're expecting, don't you think? It's like a great thing, right? You'll be totally cool, like the ultimate sort of flip out, And then, if enlightenment is the realization of selflessness, then who is appropriating the experience of enlightenment? Who is going to appropriate it? And then also, if everything is void of intrinsic reality, including voidness, including nirvana, where are you going to go above and beyond everything? Actually, you're being infinite. You do become infinite, they say, and above and beyond, and yet your infinity is embedded within interrelationships that are infinite with all beings, in which you can't find yourself apart, in a way. Or something like that. I mean, you can't describe it, supposedly, but that would seemingly be a kind of cruel letdown, wouldn't it? Boom, you're going to take off into the absolute, like John Glenn, whappo, out of here. And then instead, everything comes into your heart. You become everything, meaning that then in all of its detail, it's your concern. All of it. That would keep you busy. So Buddha is busy in a way. But they say Buddha never does anything. On the other hand, in a way, you do see through everything. So it's a kind of virtual level that enables you, actually, perhaps, to embrace this incredible matrix and interconnectedness of the lives and minds and hearts and thoughts and realities of all beings on many planets in many ways. It's inconceivable. The whole thing is inconceivable, but whatever it is, it was different from what Tsongkhapa expected, viscerally what he expected. He obviously had definitions of it before, like I am speaking from definitions personally, myself, not from experience. So, although I can speak that, I'm still expecting something else, do you follow me? That's why he said it was opposite from what he expected, I think. So then from that, he went down nearby there to an ancient old temple, which was near the Jingji, a place called Jingji, near Olka, in the Olka Valley, where there was an old statue of Maitreya, a standing statue of Maitreya, the future Buddha, that used to talk to people. It was one of these really holy statues, like Lourdes or something, where people would go and the Maitreya would talk to them and encourage them. And so he went there, and it had become dilapidated and so forth, so he was very poor. They'd been on retreat for years. So he and his friends, they made a little ritual to the wealth deity, and the next day a whole bunch of artists showed up, and nomads, and no wonder, because from the time he achieved that experience, then everybody in the Olka Valley, and as it turned out, everybody in all of central Tibet, saw Buddhas in the sky everywhere, all the time. It was like a collective mass hypnotic delusion, collective vision that went on for months and months. So then in the process of that, lots of people showed up and they said, and they didn't really know who caused this or what. I mean, he didn't claim it either, but there was an incredible energy going on everybody was feeling. Tremendous charismatic energy. The 8 people who were with him were having amazing experiences, and everybody was having group visions. So all these wealthy nomads came and gave him a lot of gold and things to put on the statue and to make new statues, and all the artists came and made new statues, and they refurbished this whole temple, and all kinds of things happened. And it was like from there until his death, in 1419, 21 years later, was like one long, huge be-in, like a Woodstock festival, basically. It was basically just like a Woodstock festival in all of central Tibet. People came from all over Tibet, and they, everybody was flipping out, and they were teaching thousands of people. I don't know how they could do it without microphones and things like that, but they would have these huge assemblies. From the time he did that, he had a constant sense of the presence of Shakyamuni, Tsongkhapa did. In other words, lucky for him, he was in this sea of beings, of totally interconnected with this sea of suffering beings, but yet Shakyamuni was in there with him, you see. And all the other Buddhas were too. So the enlightened beings were outnumbered, the infinite enlightened beings were outnumbering or overwhelming the infinite unenlightened ones who were suffering, luckily. In ancient India, there's a legend the Tibetans have. It's in the Buddha's biography, in India, actually, it's the Indians also, which was that the Shakyamuni Buddha had a period of miracles, what is called a time of miracles, toward the end of his life, where he was being challenged for a while by these other yogis and teachers and people who were kept saying, and they were annoyed because Buddha would, the different donors and patrons were liking Buddha better than them. So then they were magical, and they had great powers, and so they had never seen Buddha use any powers. They thought he was just like a wandering philosopher, like a Socrates type with a toga. So they kept challenging him to contests of miracles. And for about 10, 15 years, he kept running away from them. So then they were getting more and more proud about what great magicians they were, you see. And finally, in one city called Shravasti, with all of the kings, and then different kings who liked Buddha were very disillusioned, and his disciples were very freaked out because they knew actually he did have a lot of magical powers, but he wasn't using them. He refused. He kept dodging these contests. He would say, okay, prepare the stadium, we'll come and have a contest, and then he would leave town that night. So they get more proud. They said, oh, he's running away from us, and they kept pursuing him. And finally, there was a time in Shravasti where all 6 of those teachers, the main 6 teachers who were challenging him, and all of the kings of these different kingdoms, and all of the people who wanted to see who would win, he finally accepted a challenge, and then he stayed, and he was there the next day, and they had a battle of miracles. And then in the battle of miracles, he did all these amazing things. The one particular thing is the most important thing I think he did in the first day, where he was given food, ritually by the king, some particular king, and he ate something just ceremoniously, and then he asked for a toothpick, and then he ceremoniously did the monk's thing of brushing his teeth or picking his teeth, and then he took the toothpick and he put it in the ground, and a giant tree about 50 miles tall jumped up, all covered with wish-fulfilling gems, glowing. Like, I consider it the first Christmas tree in history, personally. That's my sort of Santa Claus view. And this tree, had a radiance so that everyone in the audience, for the subsequent 2 weeks, by receiving the light from the jewels on this tree, became temporarily clairvoyant. And they could hear each other's thoughts, totally. So like husband and wife could hear what the other was really thinking, brother and sister, friend and friend. So people became very concentrated. They were like, okay, I'm going to get enlightenment now, boy. Because their thoughts were audible to everybody else, something like this, you see. In the real underlying thoughts, So they became very concerned to cleanse their minds, you could say. And then this went on for 2 weeks. Then he rinsed his mouth, and then these lakes occurred, and then et cetera, et cetera. And after a few days, the challengers freaked out and jumped into the lake, actually, and ran away. And then he gave these teachings and performed these miracles for 2 weeks. One of the other miracles I liked was for his father, because his father had been, his father was pleased. His father was there, all his own native kingdom were there, the Shakyas. But the father was depressed about the Buddha, you see, because the father was a king, right, and a general. A king means a general in the army. And so the father had been prophesied. Remember when Buddha was born, I think many of you know the Buddha's life story. When he was born, it was prophesied that he would either be a world-conquering monarch or he would be a Buddha. And the father did every effort to make sure he would become a world-conquering monarch because he wanted to have his son conquer the world. Naturally, that's what a king would like, right? So Buddha was this, and he was very mortified, the father, that Buddha was a mendicant, great teacher to be sure. He enjoyed that everybody honored the Buddha, but he was too penniless, so that made the father upset, you see. He didn't have any worldly power, you see. So Buddha said, Dad, I know that there's something secretly bugging you. Around on the 14th day, the father and the Shakya kingdom came and made their gifts to the Buddha. And he said, Dad, I know that you're upset about something. He said, and you feel I didn't really make my mark in the world. I know your son didn't really, do it, like conquer. So I want to have a special thing for you, he said. So then he looked at his father, and then this ray of light came out of his heart, and then there were 2 Buddhas on the tips of each ray, you see. And then from each Buddha there, a ray of light came from their heart, and there were 2 Buddhas on the tips of that ray. And then each Buddha, 2 Buddhas on the tip. So eventually, everyone had this vision, but especially the father, of sort of the Buddha's image, or the Buddha's replica, but living, not just a statue, like a living little embodiment of the Buddha in sort of the core of every atom in the universe. You know, vast, infinite, like across galaxies and stars. There were all little Buddhas everywhere, little Shakyamunis. So he said, "What do you think, Dad? Did I cover the universe?" So then he kind of, Shuddhodana was, the poor old father was kind of mollified by that. "I guess you made your mark, son." So, but anyway, so Tsongkhapa, after this attainment in 1398, he was completely obsessed with this vision, basically. I mean, they were sort of living in this same sort of Woodstock Festival vibration. Like that, they look back to the time of Buddha, which was like a Woodstock Festival type of vibration. Of sort of people really being in what they call in anthropology a liminal moment, you know, outside of their routine, sort of everybody coming up to their different possibilities, like, you know, like really bringing out in themselves something special. And so in 1409, you know, then they did different things, and they went here and they had assemblies and they taught different things, and they're considered several major things that he did. But in 1409, he founded the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa and refurbished all the temples of Lhasa. The whole population of Tibet came to Lhasa, and they spent these 2 weeks in that kind of liminal time. And in a way, they routinized the liminality, to use an anthropological term, by saying that from now on, at the heart of our society, at the main sort of renewal time of each year, at the New Year's time, we're all going to be in this liminal time. And the social authority gave the keys to the city to the monks, and there were no police, and there was no productive business, and there was no trading, and everybody prayed and made offerings and did rituals and whatever. It was like, you know, Dharma practice. They were like, the whole place was like lifted off into kind of a rapture, kind of social rapture. What I call a kind of millennial consciousness, in other words, temporarily was instituted for a 2-week period, remembering the millennial moment in the Buddha's life and looking to a millennial time within the Buddhist sort of legend and the Buddhist teaching of where you know, slowly when you become a Buddha, you make your whole planet into a millennial reality. You know, because when you become a Buddha, since you are interconnected with all the other beings in the Mahayana, you can't just be a Buddha and other beings still wallow around wherever they are on 14th Street. You know, you have to change 14th Street so 14th Street brings those beings along. Do you follow me? You recreate 14th Street so it becomes a vehicle of enlightening beings. The grass and the trees and the dogs and the cats and everything works to enlighten all the beings around you. I mean, at least that's your vow, that's the vision, that's what it is presented in the Mahayana Sutras that you can do. And in fact, the mandalas, you know, of Tantra, like that kind of mansion over there in that case, mandalas are really kind of blueprints for creating a Buddha land, a Buddha world that you want to create when you become a Buddha. You see, because you resolve not just yourself in the Mahayana, I'm going to be enlightened and escape from all of this. You resolve that I'm going to be enlightened and that my world is going to be enlightened and all the beings I know are going to be enlightened. Because that's how they're all going to be happy, you see. Right? So they routinized that in these 2 weeks, you see. And then they built all these huge numbers of monasteries and they built all these great mandalas. So from that time, you know, I think, you know, millennial consciousness, oh yes, what I mean by millennial consciousness is this, like, for example, take Judeo-Christian society, particularly Christian society today, and Judaic as well, and Islamic as well. They're waiting for the second coming, or particularly Judaic and Christian. And that is to say, you know, Christ said he would be back. There would be a time when kingdom of God would be manifest in earth. And the sort of Caesar and the bad stuff, the powers and principalities would be ended. You know, in the book of Revelation talks about, you know, the beast and the whole thing, and then there's a final big blast off. And then the New Jerusalem is there, and then one thing that you may not realize from not having maybe read Revelation lately, in the New Jerusalem there's no religion. There's no churches, no temple. There is a temple, but the temple is everywhere. There's no particular rituals because God is all in all everywhere within the community in the New Jerusalem. And so a millennial time is a time when fruition is possible for everyone, type of thing. Like, for example, when Shakyamuni Buddha was personally there, if you met Shakyamuni, apparently they say when you met Shakyamuni Buddha, you were sort of lifted to your ultimate possibility for that life. Whatever your brain, your heart could do, you would immediately unfold for you. Now, that doesn't mean everybody would become perfectly enlightened as a Buddha when meeting Shakyamuni, because some just didn't have the capacity, so to speak. It took more evolutionary time, but they could come to their maximum developmental level for that life anyway, and set themselves on a path that would lead them very quickly to evolve, at least the way the Buddhists present it. So meeting Shakyamuni is like meeting a doorway into a rapidly approaching future of total fulfillment. And so there's an idea of fruition, of millenniality, the millennium, the real millennial idea, that something will happen where everyone will have fruition. Instead of living in the causes of things, hoping someday for something to work out right, and just doing a little here and a little there, and then deferring the gratification, and deferring the beatitude, and deferring the realization, you see what I mean? Which is the way we normally progressively live, right? So Tibet reached this kind of millennial thing. Now, millennialism has broken out in all cultures. It has broken out here and there in Judeo-Christian culture. People think it's now New Harmony, these charismatic communities. Actually, at the time of the Reformation, there were a number of them, and then they went and killed them all, because in general, the people are suspicious of this millennial thing, because people think, well, God is here, Jesus is here, we can do whatever we want, everything is fine and perfect, leading people to indulge all their negative things, you see. So there's a big suspicion of that idea that you should have fruition, and you should, in fact, suppress your desire for fruition and channel your libido into productive deferment and work, and slave away to be productive for someday someone to enjoy it somewhere. Right? That's the way we grew up. That's the way we're educated, the way we're taught. And like we go to school, and then we got to get to graduate, then we got to get our high school diploma, then our BA, then our PhD, then retire finally, and someday we're going to relax. And we're going to collapse, I think, rather. Usually, unfortunately. So, but anyway, when a society reaches that, and where the way that they understand it in the society, it's not considered dangerous or destructive, but it's considered liberative, because what it means is, if you're in the presence of fruition, in the potential and possibility of fruition yourself, that means that it's like in the Vimalakirti Sutra, where the Buddha put his toe on the ground, everybody suddenly saw everything as potentially perfect, saw themselves in an ideal situation to evolve with maximal effectiveness and power and speed themselves to a higher state, to a more happy state. Then you no longer say, like, what do we say? I say, well, I don't want to go on retreat now. I don't want to really practice this teaching or meditate on that, because first I have to finish Tibet House or finish my book or do this or do the other. You see, build the retreat place or raise money or whatever it is. Something else has to be done because the world is so imperfect. So I can't really put into practice. Or I can't be nice to you now because, first I have to be mean for a while so I can get ahead, and then I'll be nice to you later. Or, we can't be nice to each other because we live in a vicious world, so we'll go on Sunday and be nice to God or something, or to Jesus or somebody, or the guy next to us in church. Then we'll go out and rip them off in business between. And that's the normal way, right? So, but a millennial thing is that everything is actually all right if you only knew, and therefore you have maximum opportunity yourself to develop yourself if you only take responsibility for that. You can't say, well, I first have to fight to defend Tibet from the Nepalis for a couple of lives, then I'll be a yogi and meditate. There's no excuse, in other words. It's one thing about millennialism, about fruitional consciousness. It kind of puts the apocalyptic consciousness, it puts the pressure on the individual to actually take advantage and make essential their life and take advantage of their opportunity, right? So that was kind of introduced as a major note in Tibetan civilization. It achieved that note. And so from the 1400s, which interestingly is very parallel to the Renaissance in the West, if you know, which was a time also when people suddenly felt that we have power. We don't have to sit here under some grubby bunch of inquisitors. We can understand something. We can make a beautiful thing. We can figure out what the stars are doing and whatever. We are made in the image of God. We have God's reason. We can do stuff. By discovering the Greek power of man, and not just being crushed under the power of God in a hierarchy as it had been. So it was a similar discovery in Tibet, but it was in a whole different context, you see. And so Tibet began very intensively to monasticize even more from the 1400s, because when everybody wants to drop out and study the whole time, the best way of organizing it is the monastic one, so far, that's been discovered. Because then people kind of keep out of trouble, They kind of don't need a lot. They're easy to take care of, and they simplify their life. And then there's enough other people who want to take care of them, because some people don't want to do it. And in a country like Tibet that had an abundant economy, actually given a balanced population that it kept, and monasticism helped with that, there was no real problem about food, or people. It was not a problem that a lot of people dropped out. In a way, where the people were dropping out from as the monasticism increased was they were dropping out of the armies, because the more people were interested in this self-conquest, self-transformation, the less they were interested in conquering others, in grabbing territories, in doing what military people do. So that's where the manpower is being drawn from. Therefore, from 1400 to 1600, there was a progressive sense among certain aristocrats. Most of the aristocrats were going along with it too. Many of them were becoming monks and attaining high knowledge and so forth, because they were intelligent and capable. And they had advantages, actually, than the lower class people. But a few of them who were wanting to rule, they wanted, where's my armies going? Where's all the land going? As more and more monasteries are built, more and more land is being given over as endowments to these monasteries. And so who's controlling this country? What does it mean that I'm the lord of the country when no one wants to be my soldier? They all want to go to the monastery, and I don't have much land to gain income from, you see. So, which is a similar thing that was happening, I believe, in the West. And it was a similar thing happening in Japan. So what happened? In the end of the 16th century, actually earlier in the 16th century in Europe, you had the Reformation, which intriguingly was some monks deciding it was no good being monks. Luther was a monk who couldn't make it as a monk, and from which he decided nobody was going to make it as a monk. And in fact, it was in principle wrong to try to make it as a monk. You were getting too proud, thinking you could perfect yourself, and you are just an inveterate sinner. There's no way to do that. The only person who can save you is God. You have to give up that you can do anything yourself, because your will itself is evil and original sin, right? And so faith alone, right, was Luther's slogan, meaning no meditative work, no effort, no way of recreating yourself in a holy, developing a holy will as a saint or something like that, right? So his was a sincere, that's what he believed and felt, how he assessed himself, and he saw the corruption in the monastic orders, and he was a reformer, and that was good. But what he didn't maybe realize was that the people who liked this message, some of them may have liked it because they had it confirmed some genuine religious insight of theirs. But some political authorities might well have liked the message because by closing all the monasteries in Germany and England and northern France and Holland and Scandinavia, what could they look forward to? Hundreds of thousands of millions of acres of rich orchards and farmlands, treasures heaped up in monasteries like mad, manpower and labor that used to work in taking care of all that monastic wealth, selflessly and corporately. Actually, Max Weber traces the selfless corporate ethic of industrialization to the selfless ethic of the working monk, making that champagne or that bread or that. That's an odd link, but that is how the great sociologist Max Weber does trace the selfless corporate work ethic of capitalism to Christianity, to the Christian monastic work ethic. And he didn't know that Buddhist monks worked, so he thought Buddhists were different. Because they had a rule not to work in the beginning, because they were supposed to just be mendicants. But they did, in fact, in different countries work. He didn't know that. So those princes exploited Luther's personal conversion and personal reform movement to take back all the land and all the people's social time, and to institute the process of what is called secularization or disenchantment, creating the sort of monistic, secularistic world that we now have inherited, of industrial revolution and so on. And that happened around that time, during the 16th century. And there was a counter-reformation. They tried to sort of take it back. The Holy Roman Empire did, and they failed. And in 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, they sort of settled the thing in the way that they did. And interestingly, in 1642, the Dalai Lama was crowned the king of Tibet. And in the 1580s, the Japanese shogun destroyed all the monasteries of Japan, the main monasteries. And in the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate became well established. So these things all happened. Louis XIV was born in 1642. It was like everything happened simultaneously, strangely, without overt connection, but simultaneously happened in a way. And yet, there was something opposite that happened everywhere but then what happened in Tibet. And why is that? Because in Tibet, the warlords lost. The only place where they lost. The monks won, and the warlords were dispossessed, not the monks. And the armies were disbanded, not the monasteries. And so Tibet went in this unique sort of maverick path. It became what I call a mass monastic society, which is not just a medieval monastic society, where monasteries are a countercultural, peaceful force trying to restrain the violence of the military orders, of the aristocracy and the military orders, and usually unsuccessfully. But now and then they provide asylum to somebody, or they mediate some conflict, or they cool people down. But very often they fail, and sometimes they even get co-opted, and the monks themselves rush off on a crusade or something as directed by the military power. So usually they're just a countercultural force that is always a little weaker and dependent upon the military aristocratic force. But in Tibet, and then therefore in the 17th century modernity, what we call modernity, secularization, etc., rationalization of society, industrialization, all of that occurs with the secular force crushing the sacred force, institutional sacred force. And in Tibet, the opposite. There's the same unification, as the sociologists call unification of the life world, as it translates in English, where the sort of people began to see everything as sort of a unified field. But the unified social field was not unified into secularism, but unified into what we can only call sacralism. That is, everything became sacred in some way. And the purpose of life was something for the individual to become liberated, enlightenment. The education of the individual was the central purpose of the society. And this is what Tibet began to develop. Now, key institution in this development was the institution of the Dalai Lamas. Tsongkhapa's one of his important disciples was, although younger, was someone called Gendun Drüba. Gendun Drüba was the first Dalai Lama, retroactively named the first Dalai Lama. His successor was a guy called Gendun Gyatso eventually, who was another one of these cases like the Karmapa. It was not a planned reincarnation. Somebody was born a little bit in south-central Tibet, east-south central Tibet, and saying, I'm sorry, I'm not so-and-so, I'm Gendun Drüba, and I want to go back to Tashilhunpo and see my disciples. And then actually, he was accepted by many, but he was not accepted by the abbots of Tashilhunpo, who said, we don't want to, what is this reincarnation? That's the Karmapas do that, we Gelugpas, we don't do that reincarnation stuff, because Tsongkhapa himself had refused to have a reincarnation, actually, had said, no, the head of the order will be someone who reaches there by merit, who's the greatest scholar, who's the holiest person, who's the best teacher, they'll be the head. I don't want to be reincarnated. I mean, if I am, I'm not going to tell you guys where I am. You're not going to find me. And so the Gelugpas kind of weren't into the reincarnation thing at first, but this Gendun Gyatso was very insistent, and he said, I am Gendun Drüba, and he convinced certain people, and then his own little household, though, had to leave the Tashilhunpo monastery that he had built in his life as Gendun Drüba, because the abbots of Tashilhunpo, which was already a huge monastery of 5,000 to 6,000 monks by then, they wouldn't accept him. They thought he was some interloper, and so he left, and which was lucky for him actually, because he spent his life on retreat in these amazing places near where Tsongkhapa had a retreat in eastern Tibet, and he's the one who discovered the magic lake, the goddess's magic lake, the soul lake of the goddess. You know that place? You read the biography of the lamas where you go and see the visions in the lake. It belongs to Penden Lama, the very fierce goddess who's on the wall of that temple there. Kali, it's Kali actually, the Buddhist notion of Kali, who's the special protector of the Dalai Lamas. And he created that. He built a triangular-shaped monastery, the only one in the Buddhist world that I know of, a triangular-shaped monastery near this magic, in a valley of the confluence of three rivers, or two rivers rather, and then the third flowing out, right, a triple wide juncture valley. Above that is this incredible bowl, glacial bowl where this lake is, this magic mirror lake. I've been there 3 times, and it's a really neat place, amazing place. It's a little dangerous though. People, people tend to get ill there a little bit, so you have to be careful who you go with. And then if you do the right rituals and your heart is pure, you will have some amazing visions. So So the second Dalai Lama. Then third Dalai Lama went to Mongolia and began the process of, like the Sakyapanita had, of making a relationship with the Mongolians and reconverting the Mongolians back to a more peaceful lifestyle, back to Buddhism. Wonderful stories about that I can't go into. And then he died there, and the fourth Dalai Lama was a Mongolian, actually. And then the fifth was then born in Tibet, but fourth had a rather short life. Fourth came to Tibet, was brought to Tibet. Then the fifth was almost having a hard time. They were being persecuted. Because at the beginning of the 17th century, these warlords were really being alarmed. They had really become alarmed because basically the mass monastic society had stripped out from under them all of the land, which meaning most of the income and all of the allegiance of the people and a lot of the manpower. And they couldn't take it anymore. And they said, we're going to have to do something to control it. In the history of China, every third generation of emperor, in every dynasty, always confiscated about 80% of the monastic land. And then in the next two generations, they would go back, and different families would give to monasteries, and they would become monks and nuns and so forth. And the sort of dance back and forth between the Buddhist order and the royal order was always difficult in China and other countries. But in Tibet, from 1400, there was a steady increase of the monastic side with no pruning back, no confiscation, because the legitimacy of the monastic people was so great because of the kind of Woodstock festival sort of atmosphere that was generated around these monasteries. People just loved their monasteries. The Chinese, they destroyed, they went in there and they did thought reform and class struggle, and they destroyed 6,250 monasteries in the 50s and 60s, not just in the Cultural Revolution, before the Cultural Revolution. They bombed them, artilleried them, cannonaded them, dynamited them. They wiped them off the Tibetan landscape, all but parts of 13 monasteries out of 6,250, which is 4 times more than existed in all of Europe in the 14th century, in the height of European monasticism. 6,250. And they brainwashed the Tibetans that these are parasitic institutions. This is why you have such a small population. This is why we were able to conquer you. This is why you don't have an army because of these terrible monasteries. This is why you're also poor, although the Tibetans were not poor until the Chinese came and took all their food and all their houses and all their land. But they were actually not poor. But anyway, this is what went wrong. This is why we're beating you up. It's because of those monasteries. They're parasites, bloodsuckers, et cetera, et cetera. They went on like that from 1950 to 1980. And therefore, generations of Tibetans were born just hearing only that. Seeing all the monks killed, thrown in prison, finished, gone, or no. If you were caught on the street with something like this in your pocket, you were put in prison for life. Work camp, beaten up, thought reform, struggled, all that kind of garbage that they did. 1980, Hu Yaobang went to Tibet and said, oh, we've messed up this country, what a mess. You guys have total economic freedom, no taxes. We won't take any food from you, nothing. We're going to withdraw some of our colonists here. They're using up your resources. And Tibet is totally free to do what it wants because we made a terrible mess. And boo-hoo, he actually cried, Hu Yaobang. That was the beginning of the end. Then Deng put him down in his little book. Get rid of that guy, which he did a year or two later. But the point is, there was the lid was lifted off Tibetans. They were allowed to do what they wanted. He thought it would mean they would develop economically, because they had been totally destroyed by the Chinese colonization and depredation. You know what the Tibetans did? They instantly went out and started rebuilding their monasteries. They instantly went and ordained themselves monks and nuns. They dug up some poor old guy out of prison. They reordained him. They got ordained. They started studying, praying, meditating, learning the language, reciting prayers, just immediately. And as a civil disobedience, it was still totally legal in China in 1980. It was like sedition to build a monastery, to do old thinking, old thing of wanting to attain enlightenment or attain freedom or whatever, But that's what they did. It was so deeply into their lives that this was the root to a permanent Woodstock festival. Was to have a lot of monasteries. Now I know it doesn't sound quite right, monks and nuns, because we think of things in terms of sort of wild and free and crazy, everybody naked running around. But energy-wise, with the tantric element, you see, getting the meditative ecstasy, the meditative ecstatic experience, the inner unfoldment of the sensitivity, the inner blisses, these are much more powerful in the Tibetan view. And when you have a critical mass of people cultivating this kind of meditative, it's much more blissful than any sort of hopping around business. It's like from the heart. It's like orgasms in the heart that spread like great waves throughout the society, ripple through the society, like brain orgasm, different from just some running around. Sweaty thing, Doesn't have to be sweaty. Really, I mean, I'm being very blunt, but that's how they experienced this in Tibet, you see. So they were able to be celibate. In fact, most of them, you'll hear from people who like to try to say, because there's a lot of false propaganda within our population put there by European journalists usually and American leftist journalists from the 50s who swallowed the Chinese line. Actually, they gave the Chinese the line that these people were serfs and feudal, and they sort of try to present the Tibetans as a bunch of Borgia-esque papists to the sort of Protestant industrialized Western people, you see. So all those monks, we don't even know what, in the Protestant, culturally Protestant, not necessarily, people may be Catholic or they may be Jewish, but culturally Protestant notion of industrial society like ours, where you have to work all the time, where you're nothing if you don't work, no work, no food, this kind of attitude, no free lunch, You talk about monks and monasteries, people with purple robes, and everybody gets subliminally. I remember when I used to teach at Amherst, a WASP bastion if there ever was one, I used to have monasticism conferences all the time, and I used to invite different people from all different kinds of religions, and I would go into that faculty dining room on their little hilltop there with all the little tweedy guys, and I would go in with the monks and shaven heads and sandals and what have you, and they'd go in there and they'd be like eating like milk and vegetarian, whatever. That was fine, no problem. I'd walk in there with some Catholic fathers, my boy, and there'd be stiff people all over. The papists are coming. Look out. I'm not kidding. It's like a subliminal thing. I noticed it. I was amazed. They're much more relaxed about some Vietnamese guy than the local father coming there. What? Thurman is bringing in the Catholics now. What is it? We thought he was a Buddhist, And really, I'm not kidding. So the leftist writers, you see, like there was Stuart Gelder in England, a guy named Israel Epstein who was an American, Hannah Louise Strong, a famous journalist who wrote a book called When the Serfs Stood Up. And they did all this stuff because and they consciously got together. This I found out from her journals. They consciously got together and they said, look, the international movement is weakened now and in a bad shape because everybody hates Stalin. And the Russian experiment went wrong. Yes, we loved them during World War II because they were allies against Hitler, but then after the war, when Stalin reverted back to sending everybody to the Gulag again, and the 50s repression and the whole Cold War, then, it's given socialism a bad name, so we've got to have the good socialists. So what's our last frontier? Well, Mao is the great socialist. So people think Shirley MacLaine was just silly and naive when she went in '72 and was taken to some Potemkin Chinese villages and said, oh, everybody's liberated in China. China's a miracle, which is what she did. And there was a big euphoria in the '70s when Nixon opened China. But that had been prepared for 22 years by leftist journalists and writers trying to pretend that Mao was doing it right, you see. Meanwhile, we now know Mao killed 100 million people. He was worse than Stalin. We actually know that now, but of course nobody knew anything then, you see. And he killed 1.2 million in Tibet, and 100 million total, probably. So countless. He just did stuff like, he just said whole counties die in a famine without shipping stuff in there because no one would tell him they were starving. He probably wouldn't have if he'd known, but it was all his ridiculous. He had this one ridiculous thing where he had everybody melt all the iron in the whole, like this chair, he melted to make pig iron because he was going to outproduce the British and the Russians in iron. He had all these little they burned up all the trees and all the wood and destroyed all their hoes and rakes and everything. And pots and pans. They had nothing to cook. They had to cook on I don't know, bricks. He was crack-ola, totally. Something in his brain, too much smoking, chain smoking. Anyway, the point is the poor Tibetans were caught in this. But from the 16th, so then in the 17th century, they built this amazing potala, the fifth Dalai Lama did, and they disarmed all of the Tibetan warlords, and Tibet became this amazing demilitarized country for 300 years, kept its independence. Then you said, closed off earlier in the question, they kept their independence by diplomacy. So actually, they did have to travel out. But the people they dealt with were Mongol Khans, Manchu emperors, mainly, and therefore they dealt with people who were also Buddhist, mostly. By this time, Islam was all in the other periphery of them. In India was dominant until the Europeans came. And then in the Turkic areas of Central Asia was all Islam, you see. So they couldn't deal with them because then they couldn't appeal to them as Buddhist leaders because from the Muslim point of view, they were heretics themselves, infidels themselves, you see. So they were a little nervous about that. So in that sense, they were a little, and they were frightened of the Europeans because they were told by the Manchus that the Europeans would destroy Buddhism, you see. So Buddhism was the central thing. So in that sense, they did become a little insular. It's all very well for the Dalai Lama to say that. It's good that he says that, because the danger would be, if Tibet gets restored some kind of autonomy, that Tibetans will again retreat, because they had such a holocaust, such a complete catastrophe and trauma of the last 50 years of their entry into the modern interconnected world was a disaster. Of this century was a total disaster for them, as it has been for many peoples on the planet. Genocidal disaster. So then from 1642, Dalai Lama was crowned king of Tibet, and you had this notion of kind of full circle. And as I said, I originally thought this was a corruption or a mistake in Buddhism. And it was only when I began to have these monasticism conferences and began to study monasticism as a historical institution that I reappropriated. I had been a monk at one time in my youth, and then resigned as a monk, and was rationalizing my resignation to mean that it was silly to be a monk, like that was old-fashioned. So I had no prejudice pro-monk thing or pro-monasteries. I thought of it as just as funky as any other Protestant does. I thought it was like, as I used to say, my image, I discovered in a dream one day during one of those monasticism conferences, that my image of monasticism was rooting for Audrey Hepburn to escape from the Mother Superior in the monastery, in that movie, to go join Gregory Peck at the bus station and go and have a happy life on Fifth Avenue. Really. And she had to like tie sheets together like getting out of prison, and climb down. I don't remember the name of the movie even, but it's an undying image I have about monasticism. In spite of having been a monk, when I was only doing it to be out of a wish to meditate and study, and I wasn't thinking about it as an institution, then resigned when I thought about it as an institution, and thought the whole institution was all washed up. Then in the 70s, when I started teaching and really looking into history of Buddhism, and looking into world history, actually, and answering the challenge of this, my favorite sociologist, Seymour Melman. I read this essay by him, written around the time of the nuclear freeze movement and the big demonstration in the park that Caspar Weinberger sneered at. And about for the nuclear freeze, I forget how many years ago that was, but maybe some of you will remember. And he wrote saying, okay, you guys in the peace movement, it's great, and you now and then you make a point, and 500,000 of you go somewhere and do something, and they take a day off at the Pentagon, when you clog up traffic. But then you go home, you go back to your day job. And they go back to the war movement goes back to its jobs, which are paid, hundreds of thousands of dollar jobs. Engineering jobs, manufacturing jobs, military jobs. You guys have no jobs in the peace movement. Where is your peace institution? How are you going to keep up the momentum to really match and put a break on and stop the war movement? He wrote an essay like that, from a sociological point of view. And I was thinking, well, come on, I'm a 60s guy, we were hippies, we were flower children. We can stop the wars, but really, can we? I was thinking. Then I look in history. Where is the institution that can stand up to the armies, to the state with its army power? Where is it? Is it the family, especially the modern industrial little nuclear family? No way. Because when you have your little kids, and the warlord comes up and says, you're going to fight in the war, or else, you hand the kids over to your wife and you go and serve. Because they are going to beat up your kids. They're going to, you know what I mean? You are vulnerable. You cannot stand against them. So, and then, they train people. Then you go into training, and you were a nice guy before, and then you come out of boot camp a vicious killer, right? Or you get washed out. And then you're ready to kill everybody. And then it's hard to unwind from that at the end, right? All those Vietnam guys shooting people from clock towers, Rambo, So I looked in history, and I defy any of you. Where is the institution that has ever stood as a bastion for an individual to resist the state? Not just personally, bravely go out and crucify me, or hang me, or burn me at the stake, or whatever, or run over me with your tank, like that guy in China who did get killed. That guy in China with his little lunch bag there, he got killed. He was shot quietly, off camera. Not that day, but sometime later. But because Deng was pissed off, embarrassed Deng on TV, man. That's really dangerous to do. And find me the institution. Where is it? Well, we might say the university. But that same essay of Millman was on and on about how all the science departments have all this DOD money, the internet was created by Department of Defense money, and they do all kinds of engineering, computer stuff for missile guidance or whatever. That's where the big money is in MIT and everything. CIA used to have them working for them, you know. So is the university really immune to the state? Can it protect you against the state? No, it cannot. And it does not. And it's co-opted all the time by the state. So where? You look at history, look at history. Monasticism is the only thing. See, the whole Tibetan social experiment, and we're coming to the end of Tibetan social history here, the whole Tibetan social conclusion is that it is quite possible to train people to transcend the fear of death and to be willing to put their lives on the line in order not to do violence to others. Just as we know universally in history, it has been possible to train people to put their life on the line in the process of doing violence to others. So we know that hatred can be mobilized and channeled and conditioned and trained and brought up to a pitch, you know, where people will be careless of their own lives, right? We consider it even heroic. We have how many movies? Rambo. But it doesn't start with Rambo. I'm sorry. Achilles is Rambo. Great classics, oh, la, you know. You know, he's Rambo. Achilles, that macho dork, Achilles is Rambo. I'm not going to fight. I didn't like what they did to Patroclus. It's just Rambo. And Hector is Rambo. You know, in other words, in cultures, militaristic cultures, throughout history, people have been glorifying that and then conditioning people to do that and using hatred as the fuel and getting them into killing each other so that they could have their wars. And perhaps it has helped. In some survival sense, different societies have expanded, you know, different people conquered this and that. They gained wealth, they gained something, they fought off enemies. So in more or less survival enhancing hither and thither, but the problem with it, of course, always was that when you had a life run by clanking soldiers clanking around, you know, in their armor, then all the peasants were all constantly under their oppression. And, you know, once you have a militaristic mode of power or dominance in a society, then the family pattern is militaristic. The father oppresses the wife, oppresses the children, you know, because the militarism filters through everything. The police are basically internal military. Prisons are. Punishments are. Intimidation of people, even within the family, is military. Because that's the whole scheme of life, right? Now, the Tibetans themselves were totally militaristic when Buddhism went there, as we've discussed in these 3 sessions. They were a huge empire conquering people all around them. But they showed that people can train themselves to be able to stand up to that without doing violence to it. Because of this way they rationalize society in this demilitarized, nonviolent way, even though the experiment failed ultimately in a multi-international sense, because they couldn't defend themselves against the British and then the communists. Still, it showed that a society can do it and can improve its own internal quality of life, even without a huge mechanical industrial infrastructure, and actually, you know, advantaged actually by lacking that, because having a balanced population, having a sense of contentment in the populace where there wasn't this infinite consumer desire in the population, neither having an infinite aggressive desire nor an infinite consumer desire, keeping therefore a good balance with a very fragile nature at high altitude, not destroying their forests, not polluting the land by mining, not wrecking their resources or overcropping their lands, but living in a very balanced, wonderful way. In Tibet, you would inherit your great-grandfather's barley. It was such a stable society. Even food could be preserved in Tibet without refrigerators for generations. You know, dried grain and things like that because of the dryness of the air in those days. So, in other words, Tibet has achieved the sort of balanced, steady state, sustainable life pattern that we give lip service to in the modern industrial world, knowing how we've bent ourselves on the destruction of the planet, and yet we won't take the steps. As a collective, we have not still taken the steps necessary to achieve it. Tibet did that without just reverting to sort of just living in the dust, without a sort of teepee existence, in a very organized, sophisticated way, with great pleasure of the mind, very, very rational and flexible and adaptable to internets and technologies and intermediate types of technologies, like prayer machines and prayer wheels and merit machines, things like that they would use. They didn't bother with widget machines. You know? And so there's a wonderful, I think, symbiosis. Not that the world will become like Tibet. That is impossible. Not only that, but Tibet will not become like old Tibet. In other words, postmodern Tibet will not be like, and I don't call Old Tibet traditional Tibet, as other scholars will, as you'll hear. I call it modern Tibet, 1650 to 1950. Now what will happen will be postmodern Tibet. And postmodern is no longer hypnotized by the enchantment of industrial, mechanical, materialistic progress. We realize there has to be a different kind of progress, quality level, spiritual level progress, without, but on the other hand, we are presented by the romantics who tell us that, unfortunately too much in the New Age sort of thing, that in order to have that heavy, steady state, we have to go back to where we're all living in the teepees. Take a brilliant critique of modernity like Jerry Mander, for example, who is brilliant, who I love him, actually. But he then has us all living in teepees. You know, and Gary Snyder, too, who's a good friend of mine. He wants to, Wendell Berry, he wants to go back to, Wendell at least wants to go back to a small farm, which would be good. But the point is there aren't enough small farms or enough teepees, and there's too many of us. So all of those kind of Jeremiahs who talk about coming to a steady state and a different life on the planet by radical regression to a pre-modern state are talking about mega death of billions of people. And they always say, well, we don't expect you to do it, but you know, you'll then industrial society will run out of oil and everyone will die and there'll be mass diseases and the bacteria will get you and whatever will get you, and then you'll be ready to come back on the farm with us or the teepee with us. They always have this kind of doomsday scenario like Western prophets tend to do. But you see, if we can instead have a partnership and a different planetary vision by partnering with the Tibetans, not that we will become Tibetans, or even that they will become like the Tibetans were. We and they will both be postmodern, but they can help us develop the technology of controlling our greed, which causes consumerism and causes pollution and destruction, and controlling our aggression, which causes militarism and the other level of destruction. And living in a balanced way and refine our technologies so that they are less destructive and get to a better quality of life by making our minds instruments of higher pleasure, instead of seeking pleasure from more and more machines, which they don't give pleasure, finally. They finally just wear us out and they pollute the planet and destroy everything in the process. Instead, find a mind that can really have pleasure by being free of hatred and envy and paranoia and fear and this and that. They can help us technologically to do that. And they believe that it's possible. They don't believe like our primitive psychology. Just as their machinery, like their auto industry would be primitive. Yak motors, I can see it now. It would be primitive. But our psychology is primitive. Freud, he says, oh yeah, I want to help you recover from neurotic misery so you can spend the rest of your life in everyday normal misery. Thanks a lot. Guy who was a coke addict and a cigar addict. There's no need to be addicted to either thing, and you could actually be happy, not just live in misery. It's what the Tibetan psychologists will tell us, not by believing in Tibet, not by having faith, but by learning how to manage our minds. You know? So this is where I see the future, I just wanted to say. And the Dalai Lama, too, he told me he's very hard to get him. It used to be. Now it's less difficult. But it used to be very hard to get him to talk about what would he like to see happen in Tibet in the future. Should Tibet get a decent deal? And should things change and this terrible genocide discontinue, if it ever would? And he doesn't like to talk about it because he doesn't like to appear over-eager or something. But he did. He said he thought that the great business for Tibet, the great contribution to the world that Tibet could make, would be in the health industry. Because he said Tibet could be like a Switzerland, you see, with sanatoria. I guess maybe he's read Thomas Mann or somebody told him about. You know, sanatoria, and they have wonderful herbal medicine. They have a calm and beautiful, clean environment still. It still hasn't been destroyed. It's a little high altitude for some physiologies, but for a short time, it's kind of exhilarating, the high altitude. It's like you get stoned, you know. Your brain gets oxygen starved, and you start seeing colors, you know. Everybody does. They have visions in Tibet because there's not enough oxygen there, you know. So it's like, it's very interesting. And so it would be, you know, of course you'd have health travel, adventure travel, mountaineering as they do, but more it would be like peaceful health travel and sort of sanatoria and this. And I think that there should be a UN University for Peace branch that teaches world leaders how to meditate, how to control their negative, bad minds and bad attitudes and exploitative desires, you know. And as soon as anybody gets elected anywhere in the world, they'd have to go for a compulsory 2-month course to save all the Monica Lewinskys of their subsequent regime from excessive predation. And also prevent them from selling out to this and that corporate interest. They should go and develop contentment, and this kind of thing. And I think the Tibetans could help them with that, and I think they could export people, and we could have a chain of spas, you know, around the world, and I think they'd be very successful, I think, you know. Chains of Tibet houses, we could have like shows and things and have lots of fun. And because, in a way, one of our problems is we are too afflicted, you know, as Buckminster Fuller said, and he blames Buddhism for this, and I think many versions of Buddhism, and even some versions of Tibetan Buddhism, can have the same problem. I agree with that critique of religion of Buckminster Fuller, who was a great hero of mine, that religions too much breed in people an inferiority complex. The idea that there's something wrong with the planet, something wrong with the life, something wrong with them, and they can't have a happy life unless they do some weird thing to it, you know. And scarcity psychology, you know, and paranoia, they breed too much. And, but the Tibetan form of this millennial consciousness from the 15th century and then socially implemented from the 17th century in those 300 years, definitely they did have a life, even as poor as some of them were. And although the richest ones were no more than maybe 500 times richer than the poorest ones, not millions of times, never, no way. And Heinrich Harrer, when he lived there, he had the worst time. He was trying to build some dikes and dams and things. He tried to hire the beggars of Lhasa at a good wage. He couldn't match their wage of religious donation, and they were much happier being beggars, and they refused to work for him. Poor guy, he was really upset. It wasn't religious ideology at all. They were just happy hanging out, you know, because it was a very cheerful place, actually, the Tibetans. I don't care what they say. Look at the color. Look at that color of this painting on this book. I mean, it is cheery. It's really cheery. That's Buddha. It's not like some gray, grim thing. It's cheery. In Japan also they have, people say the Japanese aesthetic. But the only reason the Japanese aesthetic externally was sort of browns and grays is because Japan was a military dictatorship. Because they went the opposite way from Tibet. They had cheery color hidden on the inside. But on the outside they were suppressed, because there was a military dictatorship. It wasn't out of nowhere that the Japanese imperialists arose, you know, in the 1867 to challenge the West in the World Wars I and II. It was out of 300 years of military dictatorship. Just as America emerges from 300 years, 400 years of militarism, and that's how we genocided the Native Americans, and that's how we are the one last superpower, and we're a big danger to ourselves. So we need some help, and I think Tibetans are ready and willing to give us a little help. Other people too, not only the Tibetans, but they have a specially useful thing in a sense because it comes from the great, as you now know, now we've run through the history, it comes from the great and majestic, magnificent civilization of ancient India, which was the great civilization of the ancient world, really. Much more important than the Greek or the Egyptian, actually, I'm sorry to say. I know Western people don't like to hear it, but it is the truth. You know, we were the, if you know, Close Encounters, right? The Martians had landed on the planet in 500 BCE. They would have checked Babylon out. They would have checked out the Egyptians. They would have checked Athens, Ratsina, and then they would have landed in India. They would have checked China, seen a few warlords over there in China, dressed in wolf skins and things, and beating their women around the corner. And then they would have checked over to India. Wow, ragas, mangoes. Boom, they would have been in India. Thank you very much.
번이로 거의 자라와 저거 누구줘라 저